We are going to finish up today by talking about how this industrialization that we've been discussing over the last couple days is going to have some important changes to demographics, like populations, and gender and social relations, all right? So we're going to get the development of some new social classes in Western Europe and in the United States. Not surprisingly, we're going to call it a large bourgeoisie or middle class. All right, a large middle class will develop in industrialized Western Europe. So here's a change from earlier time periods. Before the industrial age, we've got a very tiny landed aristocratic class, those people that own the land, and that's where their wealth comes from. With the late Middle Ages and then certainly into the 16, 17, and now accelerating in the industrial age, we get a growing middle class that had never really existed before. And their wealth will not be strictly tied to land ownership. And by the 19th century, their wealth is going to begin to eclipse that traditional landed aristocracy. You can become far more wealthy tied to industry than you could being tied to land and the production from your land. We're also going to see some new ideas about where this land comes. Because remember, when you are part of the landed aristocracy, where does your wealth come from? It comes from the land, right? But then if you have a kid who will inherit that land, where does his wealth come from? The guy before him, and then the grandson who's still on that land. His wealth comes from the family land, okay? It's all inherited wealth. Whereas with the rise of an industrial bourgeoisie middle class, where does the wealth come from? Industry. But does it matter necessarily who your dad was?
No.
No. Okay? Now, it could be, of course, the sons and the daughters of the wealthy are themselves going to be wealthy. But we have many instances of regular people or even lower class people who have the ability or some idea and find fortune within the industrialized class. So we're going to start to have some new ideological ideas popping up that will say that in the industrial age, wealth is no longer needed to be inherited. It's not tied to your land ownership. Wealth is derived, it's going to be believed, from hard work, from good ideas and intellectual ability, from drive, and a word that we see thrown around a lot these days, something like grit, like putting up with negative consequences sometimes and overcoming them. And then if you have skill or drive or work ethic or grit or ability of some sort, you can achieve in this society. It doesn't matter who you are. You probably remember from AP US History last year, like talking about people picking them up by their own bootstraps, right? And doing the work on their own and becoming successful on their own. This is going to have support from notions like Herbert Spencer's idea of social Darwinism. And we'll talk a little bit more about this at a later date, but you guys have heard of this before?
Yeah.
Okay. So Herbert Spencer is going to take the ideas of Charles Darwin that he'd been working with in the biological realm, where Charles Darwin would start talking about ideas of evolution and a survival of the fittest in nature. Like those creatures and organisms that are more fit for survival ultimately succeed, while others die off and disappear. Herbert Spencer will say the same is true for human society. And it is absolutely appropriate, according to the social Darwinists, that some in society will become extremely successful and wealthy, and that many more in society will live in poverty. Because that's what social Darwinism says, that the human world is also a survival of the fittest, and some humans, some individuals, are more fit for success than others. All right? Now, this is also kind of cold and heartless and ignoring a lot of other situations that pop up in human existence. But this certainly gained a lot of traction in the 19th century. The idea that you can be successful, you can achieve the American dream if you just work hard, right? And hard work can give that to you. And if you're not achieving it, you're probably not working hard enough. Poverty, the Darwinists believed, social Darwinists believed, was just a natural condition for inferior individuals. Do we see why this is so controversial? Right? I mean, this is heavy stuff. So at the same time that we're having a new growing middle class, we also are going to see a large urban poor class developed. Generally, people living in poverty. Yes, sir?
I just have a question about Spencer. Was he an elitist?
I guess we could call him an elitist, sure. Yeah. Well, okay, so we can talk about this at a later date some more, but the eugenics movement that is going to grow in the late 19th and early 20th century, you don't need to write this down necessarily, just hear it. The eugenics movement is going to be supported by ideas of the social Darwinists. The eugenics movement says, okay, some people are just naturally superior and some people are naturally inferior. The eugenics movement made some pretty drastic and we would say today disgusting steps to weed out inferior individuals. They supported things like sterilization and stuff like that of people that were maybe not seen as fit in society. So yeah, there are connections there. We're also going to see the development of a large urban poor class. Generally poor Americans or Europeans living and working difficult labor conditions. These people are oftentimes at the mercy of the business cycle. Like if you guys remember in economics last year, you might have talked about a business cycle where there are ebbs and flows within the economy. There are good times followed by bad times. We might remember that. Well, if you are part of this poor urban class, you're at that mercy where in times of an economic downturn, you might lose your job. You could become unemployed, all right? And in the era before unemployment insurance, this could be disastrous for you and your family. So we see the rise of poor living conditions. This is a picture from a photographer named Jacob Riis. You guys remember him from last year? Jacob Riis was in New York City, and he took a new invention of the camera with a flash and went into some of the darkest areas of the city that previously hadn't been shown to people. He put it together in a book called How the Other Half Lives, and he showed a lot of the wealthy elite of American society who were buying books and reading books how other people actually lived. His book was called How the Other Half Lives, but it probably was even more than half of the population. So layoffs were uncommon, or were not uncommon. Unemployment was a problem, and that would lead to other social issues like high alcoholism in poor communities and high crime in poor communities. There's another picture from Jacob Riis taken in one of the bars or taverns of the era. We are also going to see some changing gender roles with the industrial age. This is largely based on class. If you are of the middle or upper class, women will not be leaving the home for work will still be connected to the home, but of course won't be performing labor duties at home because the upper class will just be hiring out and bringing in domestic servants. If you guys have ever watched any of Downton Abbey, you guys can see how that looks for the upper classes. For the lower classes, we're going to see more women and men leaving the household for their work. All right? Remember, in agricultural societies, everything was centered on the farm. The man and the women and the children all worked on the farm, which was centered on the house. Right? And so they spent a lot of time with each other. Now with the industrial age, men are going off to work for 12 or 14 or 16 hours a day. And in many cases, women are going off to work for the same type of work day. So here's a picture of a factory, a textile factory, with women performing the labor in there. In the middle class, men typically became managers of these companies or factories, while their wives rarely worked outside of the home. We would see changes in family dynamic as well. During agricultural ages, and guys, the same thing is still happening, right? We're talking about Western Europe and the United States. In the rest of the world that is still strictly tied to agriculture, they're going to remain a continuity through this time period. But in agricultural communities, we tend to see larger families or even extended families working together. Many families pooling their resources to work on common farms. With the industrial age, we begin to see the disappearance of the extended family in importance and the rise of the nuclear family, where it's just a mom and a dad and their children. With the rise of the nuclear family in urban areas, people began to be married much later. You guys remember Romeo and Juliet? They were like 15 years old when they were getting married, right? So people began to get married much later, and that's going to continue. My wife and I, we didn't get married until we were 28 and 27 years old. And some even said that that's too early, all right? So it's not, it is far more uncommon today for people to be married when they're 18, 19 years old. Usually if you hear someone getting married when they're 18 or 19, you might be saying something like, what are you doing that for, right? And so I guarantee if you're not saying it, some people are telling them, don't get married that early, all right? So marriage is going to start to come much later in these industrialized societies. And of course, if people are getting married later, they're going to have fewer children. But not only will they have fewer children because they're getting married later, but they're also going to have fewer children because children are going to transform from being economic assets for a family. Can we all listen to this because this is important? They're going to transform from being economic assets to a family, where even on a farm, a child who is 3 and 4 and 5 years old can do something to help and be productive. In an urban situation, there's much less for those children to do, especially once those child labor laws are enacted. Once we get to the late 19th and early 20th century where we start to have prohibitions against child labor, now your children become even more of a burden. You guys are expensive to your parents. You don't bring anything into your parents, right? Yeah, you make us happy sometimes. You don't make us happy sometimes. But you cost a lot of money for all of your activities and all of that food you like to eat, right? Oh my goodness gracious. We don't get to do what we want to do anymore. You guys are a tremendous burden on us. And that's why we only have like 1 or 2 or no kids anymore. It is far rarer today to see families of 4, 5, 6 or more children than it is to see families of 1 or 2 children. And that is seen in this graph here, guys. I like this one because it takes us back all the way to 1800, when women were having about 7 children per family. And then by today, or close to today, we're under 2. Remember, societies that have under 2 children per woman have populations that will be in decline unless you bring in immigration. And that's how the United States still has a growing population. So this is where we are at now. Anybody know what this is called?
Baby boom.
That's the baby boom generation. That brought a little bit of a change, right? But now all those people are retiring and we got to pay for them somehow. Questions, comments, concerns? Would you guys be able to write about some dramatic demographic and gender and social changes because of the Industrial Revolution?